Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Human Risk podcast. And as we all face uncertain times, we're having to change our behaviour, we're having to change the way that we work. I thought it would be interesting for us to explore what that means and how we can think about managing the challenges that poses. And I was speaking to Ben Cattaneo, who is the host of the All Things Risk podcast. You can meet him in episode 20 if you haven't listened to that already. And Ben and I were talking, and given the fact that both of our podcasts cover risk-based topics, we thought it might be interesting to sit down and have a chat about the current situation, what we're both seeing and how we are thinking about it from a risk perspective. And one of the conclusions that we reached in our discussion was that this is an opportunity to try new things. So with that in mind, I am delighted that this episode is the first of my Crosscasts. Now, a Crosscast is basically when two podcasters get together and they jointly produce an episode that they release on both of their podcasts. And given Ben's is the All Things Risk podcast and mine is the Human Risk podcast, there's obviously a very simple opportunity to create the All Things Human Risk podcast. So coming up on this episode is me talking to Ben about, well, just what we're seeing, what we're feeling, what we're thinking, and reflecting on the behavioural aspects and dynamics. As ever, it's an experiment, so keen to hear your feedback, but hopefully you'll enjoy this conversation I had with Ben Cattaneo on the first ever All Things Human Risk podcast.
Good evening, Christian. How are you?
I'm well, Ben. How are you?
I'm well, and looking forward to the inaugural episode of All Things Human Risk.
I'm really excited about this because one, the name fits nicely together, but I think there's a beautiful kind of coalition of the two areas that we look at, and hopefully we'll have some fun exploring it with what I think is one of the most fascinating topics we could possibly have come up with.
Well, I don't know where to start, but maybe we spoke a few days ago and I was also in a different mood as well a few days ago. And we were just talking before we went on air about how every day seems to be slightly different. We have a different take on things. Maybe new things come out in the world, even though this is moving at a snail's pace, right? Because it's social distancing, right? And flattening this curve is like watching paint dry in one way of looking at it. Another way is just the ebbs and flows of what goes on in the world and how people react to this is quite fascinating. So it is a wonderful time to be involved in risk in spite of the circumstances.
Right. And I think the way you depicted it is really interesting because on the one hand, nothing really, stuff happens. And of course, there are tragedies every single day. And some good news stories as well, right? So if you looked at it and what happened today, a lot of things. But for most of us, fortunately, we're just sitting at home waiting for kind of something to happen. So on the one hand, there is kind of progress out there and things are going on. On the other hand, there is literally nothing happening. It's Groundhog Day for most of us as we sit at home and occasionally venture out for legitimate reasons. And I think it's really interesting because it demonstrates one of the sort of tenets of the way we think, which is we look for results and action. And if you think about dieting, if you think about any kind of plan that we have, it's all around progress. And we know that things don't happen as quickly as we'd like them to, and we're focused on the here and now. And so I think this is really testing us because we're being asked to do something that is relatively simple, which is, compared to the Second World War and the sacrifices made there or the military or even the emergency services on a day-to-day basis, we are doing pretty much nothing, right? We are just literally sitting, as somebody said, sit on your couch and watch Netflix, right? It's not difficult at all. And yet it feels quite challenging because I think the contrast with the world that we had is quite extreme. And we're just used to seeing results instantly and we get information quickly. And so there's this really strange piece that's being exacerbated, which is the human desire for delivery. We want here and now. And that's why we want everything immediately and quickly. And that's just not happening. And we're being asked to do something that feels really pointless. Just sit around and do just the best thing you can do is nothing. Hang around at home doing nothing.
Yeah.
And we're waiting for that result to happen. And I think this is testing us in really interesting ways because if we were making massive, if it was food shortages or other sacrifices, then I think we'd have a place to go where we would say, it feels really. Instead, it just feels, I think there's a little bit of guilt in there. There's a little bit of, well, how can this make a difference? And we just don't understand.
There's a lot of good stuff that I think there's a lot wrapped into what you just said. Working in risk, I'm busy. At least my Monday to Fridays are quite busy. And then on Saturday, I felt really down because I hadn't really processed what perhaps other people were processing because my days were full and busy. And then Saturday afternoon, I was like, oh my God, I can't go out. I can't do this. I can't do that. And I just sort of had a bit of a moment of what's going on. And I think that there is certainly a lot of, I don't know if you've read this article about grief.
Yeah, the HBR article, we'll link to that because it's really good.
Yeah, and there's so this article about, this sort of discomfort, that the headline is the discomfort you're feeling is grief. And it's David Kessler is this expert on grief, and it's grieving a lifestyle that we had a few weeks ago, we don't have now, and there's uncertainty around when will we get it back, if we get it back, and people's lives are on hold. And I think there's this big contrast to how we often view things in both business and life, that there's always progress to a goal, progress to a thing, and it's very linear. And when we don't have that, we feel very uncomfortable.
And I think it's progress and certainty, right? Mm-hmm. So I know that if I do certain things, there will be, if I save money, I will be able to do certain things. If I work hard, now occasionally that gets challenged, and the idea, not everything works in that linear way, but that's broadly how we're brought up and how we operate. And what we've got here is a combination of kind of repetition of the same old with no change, and no certainty as to when it's going to finish. And I think that causes us immense problems because we can't say this will be done by pick your date. Nobody knows for sure. I would like to say that it's going to be done in 3, 6, 9 months, but I just don't know, and none of us do.
It's that input-output equation isn't really, we don't know what that is. We don't know what the inputs what inputs will lead to what outputs. And that is very disconcerting. It's the same thing with people that go on these silent meditation retreats, that you go somewhere for a week or 10 days. And I've never done one, but apparently it is like torture the first day or two. It's how will I get through this? Because you're not allowed to speak, and you meditate, and there's very little food. There's very little stimulus. And there's still loads of stimulus all around us. We can do all kinds of interesting things with the internet, but there is a point where I think people have to slow down and think and process where they are, process where we are as humans. And that is actually quite difficult.
And I think, what's interesting here is if you go for your normal cues, find out what's going on, right? The first one is other people. Now, you don't have that except in a digital form. So we're having to go and lean on, the cues that we take from other people. Either we go to social media, or we have a weird thing where we're used to interacting face to face and it becomes digital. And actually, it's just as easy for me to speak to someone. I've had more calls with people in the US and Asia than I have with people in London. And so we're messing around with all of those normal cues. The media is filled with this stuff, and we're getting all sorts of different. And then we move to social media and the challenges of misinformation. So I think the normal skills that we might have to navigate potentially a period of uncertainty are being undermined, and the cues are being taken away or presented in different ways. And we've got to adjust to all of those things. And, as I think about how do people react to other forms of disaster that we might be used to. And of course, I say if you look at Asia I think the reason you've got better control around this in South Korea, in Hong Kong, is they've seen this before. They had SARS and MERS, and so they are used to these particular dynamics. If you look at the response elsewhere in the globe, it's been very much around responding in a way that I understand. So you could look at, say, the areas in the US, Louisiana, for example. I understand some of the panic buying and the reaction there because they're reacting in a way that a response to Katrina, right? They've seen that before. And I can't always necessarily point to the cues, but I think we cleave towards what we know. And of course, for many of us, this is hugely unknown, hugely destabilizing. So for all of those reasons, I think it's not surprising that we're not handling it, without thinking about it. We're not handling it particularly well, and because we're not equipped to.
Some really good stuff there as well. And that thing about clinging to things that we know, that can actually be quite useful if done in a very productive way. So for example, all the experts talk about the importance of ritual and routine when working from home. So keep your normal working hours, all of this sort of stuff. And if you are, I forget who this was, but there was this, I'm going to get this horribly wrong, but story of someone on is it a desert island or anyway, desert islands, prison environments, submariners, people that live in isolation, they emphasize the importance of routine, of maintaining strict hours. And doing that is a way of adding certainty to your day, because everyone sort of vacillates between needing more certainty and more uncertainty. And at these periods in time, many people need more certainty. So the way to find that and to do that is to do some routines, work out at the same time every day, even though it's indoors, keep your same sort of working hours, close the laptop. I even spoke to a friend of mine who, what he does every day is he has a family. So showers, gets dressed, walks out the front door, walks around the block, goes straight to his workstation, and when he comes back in, starts his working day, and then does the reverse at the end of the day. That's a little bit extreme.
To literally unwind it, right?
Right. And it's just a way of clinging to different types of certainty. But when you also think about moments in which you're in profound uncertainty. So one of those examples might be if you're traveling or living and working in a different culture. Then I always found that, why do expats hang out together in parts of the world where there's so few of them? It's because they're clinging to that certainty. And people who are expats, they make friends with other expats, with people they normally wouldn't associate with. But it's just that people thrown into a uncertainty, not sure of the culture, the norms, and finding ways to attach to different pillars of certainty. And that's not necessarily a bad thing.
So I love the word expat, because it's funny. One person's expat is someone else's immigrant, right? And we use this term, and I think there's something really interesting in the word expat, because it's expatriate. So it's literally taking you out of one patriarch and taking you to another one, right? So the word itself tells you everything you need to know, where in fact, actually, those people are immigrants. But it's the perspective. And so I think that's an interesting thing there that says, of course, we take our past and our history and our background and the things that we know with us. And you see people handling this in very different ways. I mean, there are some interesting people, UK citizens that live in Spain who have just moved there. And frankly, they might as well be living in parts of the UK. It's just a bit sunnier. And of course, they're struggling for all sorts of reasons that we don't need to go into at the moment with what's happening. But I think that's an interesting point, which is that we cleave to what we know and we grab hold of it. And as you were talking about your friend's routine, I'm struck by two things. The first one is, absolutely, if routine works for you to get through this stuff, use it. Absolutely, lean on it. It gives you security, stability, and I think there are people, particularly if you've got lots of domestic commitments, it makes a lot of sense to do that. But I would also say, I think there's a really interesting thing, and this is where travel, I think, is quite enlightening. Ironic thing to be talking about now when we're not really doing any, but you get to see new ways of doing things. And I'm trying to treat this, and I'm lucky I don't have kids, and I've got a partner that's very understanding and wants the same thing. I see this as an opportunity to try new stuff. And that's from a business perspective, that's from a personal perspective. And so whenever I read advice to people, which says, make sure that you get up in the morning and have a shower, right? For some people that works. For me, I look at it and go, this may be a great opportunity for me not to have a shower at whatever time in the morning, right? Maybe I will definitely have a shower, by the way, listeners, just to be clear. The current health crisis would suggest that's a smart thing to be doing. And it's not healthy anyway. But I might choose to do it at a different point in time. And I think there's a really interesting opportunity here for those people that can, and I recognize not everyone can, to try new things, to try new habits, to try new patterns. Because I think one of the things that's interesting about what's happening now is that we have an opportunity to break some of the cycles that I think are not healthy. So if you look at the standard, and this is knowledge economy talk, right? If you work in a call center, if you work in a delivery round, if you're doing something that has a sort of set pattern to it, it's slightly different. But for those of us that are in the more kind of creative space, more knowledge economy space, we have an opportunity to try things differently, and we can do tests and we can see what works and we can experiment. And maybe, for example, we are naturally meant to have a nap in the afternoon. If I go way back when, our sort of ancestors might have had a sleep in the afternoon, and they would have reacted differently to the environment and responded accordingly. If they're tired, maybe you sleep. And I think there's a real opportunity here for to try new things, and for every single one of us to find our own kind of biorhythms and patterns that work for us in an environment where we're permitted to do that. Because there are no rules at the moment, that sort of specifically say you have to do X or Y. And so to the listeners, I would say, think about it this way as in the same way that if your normal commute is disrupted, the train line that you take is out of action, then you find a bus that gets you there. I think this is a great opportunity to disrupt patterns and try some new things. And what we discover in the past when people have done that is they've stuck with the new way of doing things because it's better for them. Might be quicker, might feel better, might be more comfortable, might just be less stress to think about it, might have less volatility in the journey. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity to think in those terms as well. So I don't want to discourage anyone. If your way of handling it is to stick to routine and pattern, go for it. But if you have the possibility of trying new things, my view is why not?
I think that's a brilliant observation. And I was talking to a feature podcast guest of mine, Georgie Nightingale, who started a business helping people create meaningful conversations. And what her advice is exactly what you advised, to break things up in terms of the conversation, to make an observation about something that might just be happening in the moment. And this is a good opportunity to test those things, to connect with people in slightly different ways, rather than just ask them, on Monday morning, how was your weekend? And it just leads to the same old crap conversations that we all hate. So at least I can't stand small talk. But if you just observe something that's slightly different about a particular person, maybe, Christian, I notice your light is a little dimmer than the other time we spoke there, or you've got a glass of something on your desk and wonder what that is. Then we start to have a conversation about, whatever alcoholic beverages you like and why, or maybe who knows where the conversation could go. And the fact that things are disrupted is a good way to open up new connections with people, and maybe send them a text or a call and just talk about what's going on in their lives in a way that will open up new and interesting forms of conversation, or new interesting ways of discovering more about that person, instead of just going through the same crap. How are you? I'm busy. How are you? I'm busy. And it doesn't get us anywhere. Whereas, how are you handling? Yeah.
So the answer to your question, and for listeners, you won't benefit from this, but we can see each other as we record this. We are operating, obviously, isolation from each other in terms of physically, but we're connected by camera. This is tonic, Ben. Unfortunately, there's no gin in it, sadly.
Right. Okay.
But I've turned my studio lights off and just gone for a lighter one, because you don't want to see me in full light projection. But I think what's interesting there is you're right. Is routine feels comfortable and it makes it easy for us, right? And if we have a lot on our plate, we want to, and that's how our brains work as well, right? So we use these cognitive biases and heuristic shortcuts to make decisions that allow us to do things like cross the road, where if you had to process all of the data, by the time you process the data, it was safe or not safe, the opportunity, if it existed, wouldn't exist anymore because the vehicles would have moved. And so I think it's really powerful to think about that, because we rely on habit and routine to get us through the day, to navigate the world that we're in. But it also produces errors and bad behaviors and bad habits that we want to kick. And of course, it makes you less resilient, because it means the moment that pattern is disrupted, you have nothing else. You have no redundancy. And we've seen this a heck of a lot in the health provision at the moment where we've, in the UK, for example, there's been this whole story about we will keep the costs of healthcare down as low as possible. How do you do that? Well, the answer is you get rid of unnecessary beds. Let's not have extra people hanging around on the off chance. And magically, when you have a big disaster, you're not equipped to deal with it. And so this thing that seemed like a bad idea at the time that was, that was out of the norm, suddenly becomes really useful in an emergency situation. And I think it's the equivalent of if I constantly take the same route to work and I have no clue what my other options are, if that's shut down to me, then I have to find other ways. And I think, we're all discovering this a little bit with how we get food at the moment. We may be going to store number 1, but if that closes, I bet every single person listening to this is thinking, if that supply, runs out, where am I going to go next? And what are my contingency plans? And I think if you don't ever step outside that regular mold, you won't be thinking in those terms. And so it will be not that you won't manage to find your way, but it's less obvious to you what those might be. And I think there's something really interesting around, I was reflecting on this. So I have I have a local guy that sells fruit. And so I go and get my fruit from him, particularly important at the moment. And he has high quality fruit. And, I was out today and he wasn't there. And I'm suddenly going, where am I going to get my... No, it's not a major problem. I'm in a massive city. I'm not worried about buying fruit, but I'm like, that's disrupted me slightly. I need to think about alternatives and contingencies. And I think it's good to be challenged like that, because if we get into a state of comfort, which we often do, particularly sort of developed countries and developed cities, we get into a rhythm and we expect things to work. Mm-hmm. And when they don't work, we don't have the wherewithal to find alternatives because we haven't built the networks, either cognitive networks or physical networks, to allow us to do that.
Yeah, it's good to disrupt those routines. At the same time, I think building those routines can help with managing decision fatigue and things like this. So it's about striking that balance. I think that's a good suggestion that you make to people to break up their routines and try something new. The nap after lunch is great. It's a great idea.
If you're breaking it up every single day, right, that's stressful and hard work. And of course, there's a reason I think that we rely on, if you look at organizationally, procedures, processes. I don't want people operating a nuclear power plant to try something different for fun. Nor do medical procedures. I generally don't want them to try things differently. I want them to, or if they're doing it, it needs to be someone that really knows what they're doing intelligently. So there are times absolutely when checklists, and there's a great book, by the way, if you've seen Atul Gawande's Checklist Manifesto. So it's a great book.
I've heard of it. I've not read it.
So it talks about the power of checklists, and it looks at situations when that matters. So for example, aircraft maintenance, you don't want someone getting super creative and go, let me just try and put the nuts on the wheel the other way round. Yeah. So there are times when I think it makes perfect sense. But I think it's also really important to explore, well, when, if that didn't work out, and clearly if we're dealing with the physics of airline safety, that doesn't change. But I think for our own environment, it's just worth reflecting. And I think this is a really good opportunity for people to reflect and say, well, look, I rely on X or Y. How could I cope? Now, if you push that to an extremity, you become a prepper and you end up with, stockpiling / panic buying. There's a whole load of things there that actually probably stymie you from other things because you've deployed a whole load of cash and energy into preparing. And yes, you'll feel really smug when the world ends, but that's pretty stressful on a day-to-day existence. And I think there's a balance here between saying which bits, where does routine make a lot of sense? With kids, absolutely. Build a routine with them because they are, they can do their own thing. But I think there's other times where it's just worth going, what would I do if... And that's an organizational thing, but it's also an individual thing.
Yeah, I agree. And this is a great time to experiment. I'm a huge believer in experiments, by the way. So this is a great time to try a few things. I like the nap at the after lunch as an idea. And I so many times I've been in an office environment and I was just longing for a nap pod. And and all I need is like a 15-minute power nap after lunch or whatever. I'm
going to tell you a story, right? So when I worked for a certain German bank years ago, right? Someone said to me, "Look, if you ever come in and you're tired," and he was kind of positioning it as if you ever have a hangover, whatever. And I was like, I was like, I pretended not to understand. Anyway, he said, what you need to do is you book a client meeting room, right? And book a client meeting room, and then you can book lunch as well, and they can bring lunch. Pretend you've got completely unethical, right? But he said, book a client. This will surprise you, the banking industry. And he says, so you book a client meeting room, go sit there, have a nap, kind of late morning to recover, and they'll wake you up with lunch, right? And he said two things. Two things I like.
Wake you up with lunch.
Yeah.
Right.
The two things I like. The first one he said was make sure you sit with your back to the door because you don't want, right? Because that gives you an opportunity to recover. And the second bit of advice I thought was genius was make sure you book lunch for 2 people. Otherwise, the game is up. And it's always struck me. And I just thought, actually, this idea of not, so it's a ridiculous story. And I never did it, but I'm pretty sure he did. But you look at it and go, there is something about sleeping during the day that's unacceptable in the modern office place. And yet it's totally natural. Jerry, if we were at home at the weekend or now, and right, if we're tired, what's the most sensible thing you can do? Go have a nap. And yet the corporate structure, if you went, I'm just off, you could say I'm going for a walk or I'm going to the gym or I'm going for a run. They're acceptable. Or get lunch or coffee. That's acceptable. But you can't say I'm just going to have a nap at my desk because you're sleeping on the job. And yet that's a damn sight better for you than going to caffeinate, going to do a whole lot of things, but it's not acceptable.
I'm a big fan of the, when you mentioned caffeination, of the coffee nap. You take a shot of espresso and then you take a nap. And then by the time the espresso kicks in and the nap, then you're just ready to go. But I agree. It's a great opportunity. The other thing I was thinking about is the importance of doing nothing. And this is a great opportunity to, quote, do nothing. And we have we're talking about taboos. Napping at work is a taboo. Doing nothing is a taboo, or has been. And I think it's actually quite healthy just to schedule nothing time, just to not have a particular appointment or an objective or try to be productive, but just to maybe just do nothing. Just sit there, maybe surf a little bit of the internet, maybe wander around your house. I think there's a huge amount of mental health benefit for just saying, look, today, this afternoon, this is just, I'm not particularly doing anything. And that's uncomfortable, but I think that's very healthy.
But I love that for several reasons, right? I think the first off is if you overplan your life, and I mean literally in the long term and the short term, you are missing opportunities for serendipity, for randomness, for comedy.
Absolutely.
And it also suggests that there's a level of certainty, a level of control. That somehow if I write it down in a plan, it will become the way the world is. And if we all think about our careers, and you and I have had a discussion about this before, careers don't come from certainly our careers didn't come from planning. We'll pretend afterwards they did, and we'll create a story, but they didn't. It was totally, I met this person, then this happened, and that happened. And we feel the need to weave a story to sort of create a sense of logic. But actually the truth of the matter is it was just a bunch of random stuff that we took advantage of. And so we wouldn't, we wouldn't be having this conversation if both of us hadn't kind of just gone for it in certain ways and kind of taken risks and not planned too much or thrown the plan that we had out of the window. And so I really like that as an idea. And I think, I've had some of my best evenings out and holidays where I've kind of gone, let's go for it. Now, you can take it too far. I don't honestly recommend getting on a plane and going, we'll work out where we stay when we get there. That's gone hideously wrong for me. It's also gone hideously right for me. And I think in a world where there's a sort of fear of missing out, it's kind of cool to just go, I've got some spare capacity for randomness and strange things to happen. And that might be awful strange things. It might be amazing strange things. But I think if you don't allow the script to write itself a little bit, you are literally going, I have plan A. And if plan A doesn't work out, I don't know because I've got plan A. And you keep coming. And I think in this uncertain world, and in a world where stuff doesn't work in a linear fashion, and there's lots of random elements, and we try and make sense of it. And we talk about, bad luck comes in threes, and we look for patterns. And the whole load of shit goes down in the world. And so I think allowing a little bit of capacity in our lives for that, recognizing that if we lived our whole lives that way,
yes, yeah,
right, we would not be fed. We'd probably be, we wouldn't have relationships, we wouldn't have jobs. It's not smart to, but I like that idea because I think there's a natural tendency to want to control stuff and letting go. And it's the same as doing stuff that somebody else says, do you want to come to this? And I know there's a limit to this, but generally speaking, unless I've got a really good reason for saying no, I'll say yes. Because what the hell? What's the worst that could happen? Now, there are situations where that's not a smart strategy, but generally speaking, I think I love it. And I think it's kind of cool. And it sort of makes us think a lot more than we would do if we just followed predicted patterns.
And I think conversely, and perhaps this is where people in our profession have, or in some ways we thrive in these types of situations, or at least handle them perhaps slightly better than others, is that there is in business and in life the illusion of control, right? And for people that are struggling at this point in time, it's because that illusion gets smashed, right? So the people, if you think about certain people, perhaps you know them in your circle, or friends of friends who are really having a difficult time now. And the reason, I think, is because they have this sort of illusion of control that's been revealed, right? So I'm going to do X, then that's going to lead to Y, and that's going to lead to Z. And now my plan's all fucked up. And I don't know what's going to happen. And what was revealed is not that the plan was bad or anything, but that you never had the control to begin with. And that's uncomfortable. And this is why you and I understand that we never have complete control over anything. There's always that element of randomness, and that gets revealed. And it's similar to organizations who may struggle with or make these sort of bold assumptions, or they have optimism bias on projects or whatever. It's just, no, there's always that you can't control everything. There's that full control is an illusion.
And I think that's really interesting because, it's much more convenient to have a story to tell that, A and then B and then C, and we can kind of predict certain components. And as you rightly point out, if I was opening a restaurant, I probably wouldn't have predicted that this is the reason I might get shut down, what's happening at the moment. And, every single business on this planet pretty much is having to think about how it handles a dynamic it probably hadn't prepared for. And so I think, there's a really good reason that we try and produce certainty, because that gives us nice charts. And if we're trying to sell our company on the stock exchange, we will produce a nice chart that says the growth will look like this. But it's all predicated on assumptions that might turn out not to be correct. And I think one of the amazing things in life is that, if you look at the things that have actually literally kept us alive, penicillin being a really good example, right? That just came because someone was messing around in a lab and saw something that wasn't at all predictable or planned. If you look at comedy, some of the best bits of comedy, the best bits of theatre come out of randomness. People coming up with strange, counterintuitive ideas. And so I love this idea of sort of, if we continue on a linear path, we'll get the same results if the environment remains the same. And what we're seeing at the moment is the environment is absolutely not remaining the same. So business models and plans that look smart just a few weeks ago can look really dumb. And Zoom is a brilliant example, right? So people just go, hey, here's a way of communicating. Oh, so you're going to take on Skype and FaceTime and you're going to succeed. Well, that's a bit, and you kind of go, they really have. They've nailed this thing. And Zoom is worth more, I think, than the top 5 US airlines combined. So, but even ignore the stock exchange valuations as a relevant metric and just go, this thing has flown like nothing else because it was timely or that was not predictable. And I think in a world that's unpredictable, we need to let in random elements and chance. And you're right, it's not naturally what we do. So risk managers and people advising in this space are probably there to just call stuff out. And I'm struck by, and we talked about this last time I was on your podcast around court jesters. It's the idea that you go way back when, and you had kings and queens, and they had a court jester who was allowed to call things out and was the only person that was allowed to mock the monarch. And that's an early form of risk management. It was basically, you can take the piss out of me because I need someone to tell me that the way I'm thinking of the world isn't right. And I think that's a really good analogy for what risk managers do, which is calling stuff out and going, yeah, I know you think it's going to be like this, but what would you do if it was like that? And you'll get rubbished and laughed at, and you become a little bit of a jester. But I think it's a really powerful analogy, which is we need to just throw ourselves out of the certainty, because we're living on a planet that could get hit by an asteroid. I mean, ignore coronavirus for a second, right? And ignore the fact that we're trashing our own environment. Right? Aliens could land, we could get, and very quickly I take myself into a territory people go, weirdo, making stupid comments. But actually, there's so much uncertainty here that this idea that we have certainty, I think, worked well in a stable environment. We do not have a stable environment.
No, and the environment is never 100% stable anyway. And I find your analogies are really interesting, the court jester one. But I think that successful people and organizations create those spaces to allow that type of, whether it's creativity or challenge or whatever, innovation, and that to allow that serendipity and that randomness to flourish. And if you do that in your life, I think that creates all types of opportunities, as I think you and I can attest. And I don't know where I was going with this entirely, but
keep going. This is serendipity, right? Just free your mind. Let's see where we end up.
I mean, I think if you were to describe 2020 to someone 5 years ago or even a year ago, and say toilet paper is going to be the foremost commodity, we are going to be all locked in our homes and all of this. So they look at you like you're mad. We're going to be wearing masks. I walked my dog with my N95 mask on yesterday, and I was walking down the street.
I'm disappointed you're not wearing it now, by the way.
No,
that would be a good look for the show.
Yeah, I know. And if you were walking by somebody looking like that in London, maybe not so much in East Asia, where wearing masks is a bit more of a convention even before this, you would have thought, well, what's going on with this dude? Like he's clearly crackers. So I'll keep my distance.
I'll tell you what's also right is I saw this great thing. We'll put a link to it in the show notes. There was a BBC reporter, I think, who was standing in Leicester Square, which is kind of it pretends to be the sort of, it's kind of like Times Square in New York. It just doesn't quite deliver, but that's the closest thing for overseas listeners. And there was someone doing a report, and it was basically one of those, we'll send a journalist out, stand somewhere with sort of iconic thing. It had the sort of cinema billboards behind. And there's a guy who walks into shot behind wearing an 18th, and I probably got the century right, 16th, 17th, 18th century plague mask.
Right.
And he literally walks behind the thing. And I thought it was lovely because it was just a sort of, it was clearly staged and planned by him, but not with the reporter. But the bit I liked was it was kind of a reminder of times gone by when the world hasn't been predictable and we've survived. And I really like, because it was a very British way of kind of, other countries you might have had people sticking thumbs up or sticking fingers or billboards. He just sort of walked past with this old school plague mask on to send a really interesting signal. And as I look at the world, I just think that, for me, summarizes where we're at, which is just sort of, the human condition is to try and survive this stuff. Yeah. And we get through what we can, and we recognize that we're not actually, we like to think we control the planet. We really don't, right? Mother Nature, and, we've talked about this before. Australia, at the beginning of the year, the story was all about Australia. Right, and bushfires. So ignore coronavirus, back to your point, right? Go back a few months and you've got bushfires in Australia, which I presume are still ravaging, but I have no clue because I'm drowned out by corona noise. And so what would people a few years back have thought? Well, yes, you're right. You would have sat there and gone, if I think back to London, we had the Olympics, it was all positive, and then we had Brexit, it's all gone a bit crazy. And so it probably would have felt unpredictable. And yet, look back into history, and you've got this is why I love this guy with the plague mask, because he's like going, we've done this before. Yeah. Right? This is history keeps repeating itself, albeit in slightly different ways. And so I agree it would have been really difficult to sell that tale. But I also think that we will get through this thing, we will learn some things, there'll be some practices that change, and then the cycle will begin again. And just a few months ago there was all this talk around 1930s Germany. Have we learned nothing? The political language. And that hasn't gone away, but we've focused our minds on something else. So I think it's sort of, how would we explain it to people a few years ago? They wouldn't have got it. But then, were we ready like 2 months ago? Probably not. So I think it's kind of it's easy to sort of say, oh my God, this was entirely unpredictable, and it was, but it wasn't. And we're balancing this thing around. History teaches us quite a lot. There's always going to be different things coming at us, and we have to combine the fact that sometimes we don't learn lessons from the past, and sometimes the past doesn't quite repeat itself in the same way.
No, it doesn't. And I think as we do these lockdowns around the world, and
lock in, I prefer, by the way, because lock in sounds
right,
positive.
Right.
More
As
fun.
we do these lockdowns, social distancing, suppression, whatever, and we flatten the curve, it goes down. What will likely happen is, well, here I go with a prediction, but what appears, there seems to be some element of understanding of this thing that will open up, and then we'll have another spike in cases, and then it will drop, and then and so on. And I'm hopeful that as we understand how this thing behaves and how the data tells us it behaves, we'll get much more predictable around how these waves look. And so we'll know that we'll have, say, a window of 3 to 4 weeks where it'll be back to relative normalcy. We can have concerts and football matches and travel and things, and then we might expect it to go back up. And so there'll be some more predictability around how this thing behaves. And I think that will be valuable to people.
But that's interesting because that says the best thing we can do for mankind and womankind is to have predictability. And so what you've just basically said is it'll be great because we'll have a pattern and we'll know we'll be able to fit into that pattern. Now, think about this. I'm going to take us to the dark side slightly here, but think about that pattern for a second. Okay, so the answer is, why will they change things? And they being the governments and the officials. Well, the answer is that they've dealt with the curve and they want to let people back out because they recognize it's good for them. But what they're basically saying is we're going to be loud out so some more of us can get ill.
Yes.
Now, I don't know about you, but I'm going to sit there and go, the moment they turn around to me and say, you are now free to do what you want, the risk manager in me is going to go, whoa, 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 right? Until you have nailed this thing down, right? I'm not going to go to concerts, football matches, whatever, because I'm like, all you're doing is basically you're trying to manage the orchestra, and by default, some more people are going to get sick. And I'm kind of like, I'd rather not be one of them if I can avoid it. And maybe if I've got it by then, I'll be going out and joyously enjoying all these things that these idiots like me will be. But I think that's sort of interesting because you were pointing towards certainty, going, that'll be good, that'll be nice when we have that certain pattern. And I'm going, why does that pattern exist? Well, the answer is the virus is doing its thing. The answer is that the people in authority, the people controlling our lives, have decided it's okay to unleash us. And I feel a little bit like we'll be in some kind of zoo that's being experimented on. And the way they're talking now is we'll be allowed out, then they'll dumb it out, they'll dumb it down, they'll play with us a little bit. And I'm like, I personally, my prediction for myself is I'm going to sit back and go, whoa, I do not wish to rush out and catch this thing, albeit that actually, I interestingly, I keep saying I'm on the cusp of the age that needs to be concerned. But it's not that simple to calculate. And maybe my mindset will be different at that point. But I'm literally sitting there thinking this is really interesting because they are controlling exactly the dynamic you've talked about, which is our desire to have controllability and predictability.
Well, they'll want that, and businesses will want that because you can create policy responses. Businesses can plan all of these kinds of things. So it's definitely a desired policy, and in the aggregate, in the main, it's a desired societal outcome because that's the world in which we live.
So you're telling me I just need to go out and get ill just to help for the benefit, in the same way I need to stay in and not get ill.
No, I'm not saying that.
I think it's a really interesting point.
But I think if you think of the mind, if you put yourself in the minds of someone who leads a FTSE 100 or a Fortune 500 company or a policymaker or a government, that's what they want. They want to be able to, okay, we know the virus exists, but let's at least be able to predict how this thing is going to ebb and flow so that we can plan and we can do things and we don't crash the economy. We know how much we can push the envelope, all of that kind of stuff.
And look, it's also, I'm being slightly facetious in kind of characterizing it as they want me to walk out there to get ill. in the, to make things work in the world that we have, we've built a world that is stable and reliable.
Mm-hmm.
So, I know that if I go to, with exceptions of kind of panic buying or whatever, I can go to a supermarket and get fed, right? And providing I've got money, generally speaking, we're okay. We've got whole sorts of protections around. So I have heating, I have the internet kind of becomes an interesting utility. And so I look at all those things and go, I require all of those things. And so to provide all of those things requires the world to kind of operate on a known basis, because you can take hedging as a financial piece, but you can take hedging as a kind of planning, risk management piece that says we manage a world on a certain rhythm that allows us to continue to supply food, to supply healthcare, to supply whatever. And so that's a natural piece. So it's a human desire to have the world that way, but it's also reality that says, look, we can't have supermarkets being supplied on a kind of hunter-gatherer basis, right? Sorry, we were only able to forage the following stuff. But it's got a little bit ridiculous, and I get really annoyed when I look at fruits. I can buy strawberries in the winter. That is absurd, absolutely absurd, because that's not the way it used to be. It used to be a bit more and now we've created this artificial world where I can pretty much, if I've got the money, I can pretty much buy any fruit any time of the year. So that's created a weird kind of excessive certainty in a world where I think a little bit more volatility around that would make sense. But I do want to know I'm not going to be running around 20 different stores looking for food and they'll go, I've sold out. So I would like some certainty that takes me away from that. And I can't have that if we don't have some form of societal control.
Yeah. Well, I think it's just that this balance and that tension between certainty and uncertainty that I think we all need to manage. And I was thinking about when you're talking about supermarkets and being able to buy strawberries and in the middle of winter and things like that. I think that some of the aspects of this society really drives us to mental health issues because we crave that certainty. And so we think there's a template for happiness and fulfillment and all of this sort of stuff. And there isn't. On the flip side, I was thinking about one of my podcast guests and a friend of mine who runs his own podcast. He's an actor in the US. And what he was able to do is he just sort of that classic actor path of audition until eventually you get a break and then you get another one. And so in order to do that, he had to take his cost of living right down. So share a flat with, studio flat in the middle of Manhattan with a buddy, work odd jobs, bartending, limo driver, whatever you can do. And then audition, and do that for as long as he possibly could. So that's his, he had to create a ceiling a floor of certainty in his life to be able to do that for as long as he possibly could. And it worked out because eventually he did get a good gig and that led to another one. And that's how Will Smith is on your podcast, right? Yeah. Right. Yeah. His name's Matthew Del Negro, by the way. And he's played in The Sopranos and The West Wing and a range of other prominent shows. He's one of those actors where you wouldn't necessarily know him by name, but you know his face because he's been on so many big shows. But you think, that guy seems familiar, but I don't know who he is. Yeah. Right. But he did this thing because he managed this. So he created this floor of certainty in his life, and it's very basic. When we think about what we actually need, it's not much, but we need some basics. And when you've got that floor of certainty, then you can kind of play with the uncertainty and you can create a life for yourself where you can. I mean, this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Right. In very simple terms, right? Which is you cover the basics so that you can take some risk with certain things. And in some cases, that's risk with salary. Sometimes it's risk with, you transplant yourself to a different location. Maybe you take risk with healthcare, pension, whatever. I think that's a really interesting point, is that it's sort of, the closer we get to basic existence, the tougher stuff becomes. So you try and build that barrier. And actually, there's an interesting point someone made to me the other day, which was, if you look at what's going on at the moment, we're all being pushed down the hierarchy of needs. Right. So we're all feeling closer to
food supply issues, health issues, kind of shelter issues. And so, what we try and do naturally is we push ourselves away from the bottom of that piece. So our concerns become, for most of the listeners of this, first world concerns, not, second or third world concerns.
Absolutely. Yeah. And even now, I think we're nowhere near that sort of, that sort of bottom of the hierarchy of needs. Nowhere near. And people are overeating. You could stock your fridges and pantries with God knows what. It's not like, okay, folks, we've got beans and we've got rice, and you've got to live on beans and rice for the next 2 months. It's not that at all.
Right. Or nothing, right? It's
Or
I
nothing.
mean, there is food is in plentiful supply. It may not be the brand you want
Right.
of the thing you want.
Right. You may not have the, whatever tipple that you prefer, your, bottles of the Malbec from the Andean foothills that you consume, or whatever it happens to be.
I can't wait to see the Cattaneo cellar. I'm looking forward to this.
Or whatever it is for you. But it's there's more than enough stuff. Again, it's more the mental health aspects of it, because it's the U.S. unemployment claims went up dramatically.
Did you see that New York Times
correct.
front page, which again, we'll put this in the show notes, but for listeners that haven't seen it, it was insane. They literally showed a chart at the bottom of the page. It's a full page newspaper spread, and they allowed them to use the right-hand side of the page to show the full extent of the bar chart. So it went up effectively to the full extent of the newspaper. It's a stunning front page that I think really illustrates the challenge. Amazing.
Now, look, for some people, this is horrible, right? So for some people, this is serious. How am I going to pay my mortgage? What about my children? All kinds of things like that. And
food, shelter, everything.
Shelter,
right.
Everything. And it'll be even worse in emerging markets. We think about India. There was a statistic about how many people are leaving urban centers in India to go to their homes because the lockdown has shut out all types of employment. And so what all these people are doing is taking coronavirus and spreading it throughout that country.
Right.
Which is, obviously it's quite scary. Now, again, maybe the vast majority of these people will get the virus and be a little bit ill, but we can't test all those people, and so that we are all systemic risk. So for some people, this is quite serious. For people like you and I, and most people in major urban centers, it's the mental health aspects of all this and the uncertainty around what this may mean for the life that I may have planned for myself, or this is going to be delayed now for 6 to 18 months, or I can't go to Ibiza this summer for X, or whatever it is. And those are quite
Yeah, I think all of this stuff, regardless of where you stand on the socioeconomic scale, represents a disruption. Now, it can be a disruption that is, threatening to your basic existence. It can be a threatening to your aspirational existence, and it can be in the kind of lunatic fringe, extremity of first world problems. But this is what I find interesting about this situation, is that money can't buy you out of this situation. We're here in the UK, the Prime Minister, a senior member of the royal family has this thing. Celebrities have this thing. This is the first thing I've seen that is, money can't shield you from.
No, money can give you a test, though. It can give you better access to a test that many others
agreed with that. But it's going to impact you on some level.
Absolutely.
In a way that gated communities and regular salary and pension, all those things, often can shield you from the realities of stuff. So what I think is interesting about this is that we're suddenly seeing people discomforted in a way that probably they weren't expecting to be discomforted at all levels. But I think it's probably having the biggest, most stark impact at the sort of higher socioeconomic scales, because we thought back to our control thing. We thought we had health and hygiene under control, right? So we have running water, we have sewage systems, we have food supply chains, we have education, we have money. There's a whole load of things that have been built up as buffets to some of these issues, and they don't act as a protection. Sure, they'll cover you for all sorts of things, but you will still be suffering in some way, shape, or form. And I think the mental health thing clearly impacts all the way down the scale. But I think what's really interesting is that this is something that is going to drive people who otherwise possibly wouldn't have had a sensible care in the world to think differently about stuff. And we're seeing, that's why I think at the moment we're seeing a drive towards, we look at values and ethics, and because you're having to make calls on stuff. So you're a chief executive of a company, you can't ignore this. You're a wealthy person, you can't ignore this. You're a you and I, you can't. Every single one of us, through our behaviors, through the way we spend money, through what we say, has to take a view on this thing. Agreed. And I think unlike climate change or many of the other things that are there where you could shut yourself off, every single one of us is living with the reality this thing might do something to us. And it's the biggest movie villain that we've ever seen, where we're kind of all having to react to it in our own different ways with our own different environments and pressures. And of course, you and I, nowhere near the scale of what this means for people that are in different circumstances. But it's not easy for us because we're having to think about stuff. But I wouldn't for 1 minute want to pretend that I was at the tough end of the spectrum. But that's not to say it's easy for either of us.
No, it's not easy. Did you see that piece around conspiracy theories and why conspiracy theories rise at these times? I thought it was fascinating. Did you come across that one?
Yeah. So I mean, the thing is, but conspiracy theories comes back to our earlier piece, right? Which is we need to make sense of the world. And when weird stuff happens, we like to find a story, and let's find so the Roswell, Area 50, whatever in the US, prime example, right? There's a whole load of stuff happening because it's aliens have landed and they've kept it secret, and Kennedy assassination, and. So I sort of smile about this stuff, and I just go, I quite like the fact that first off, we should always maintain the ability to question and challenge authority, because when we don't, that goes hideously wrong. So the nut jobs and the wackos that are pushing certain stories, I go, we need you to an extent, right? The fake news, blah, 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 agenda is an absolute nightmare. And there's lots of people that demonstrate themselves to be manipulable. So I don't know where we draw the line here, because I don't ever want to have a world that certain political leaders seem to be encouraging, which is sort of, yes, you're doing an amazing job. Good. No questions will be asked. And in a crisis is precisely when we should be doing simultaneously supporting leaders and challenging them, right? You should not have carte blanche just to do whatever. You should be called out on a challenge, but equally supported when you're trying to do the right thing. And I think this conspiracy theory thing is really interesting, because it sort of dives into that space and goes, in some cases, this helps people to navigate a challenging world.
It does. Yeah.
Right. That's a perfect story, right? I'll come up with this thing, and I love it. In the UK, there's this whole thing about, I think it's global as well, 5G.
Yes.
The mobile networks have caused coronavirus. I'm like, oh, okay. And part of me just goes, well, maybe I should listen to that. And then I go, well, what are you doing? So yeah, I think it's an interesting dynamic.
It's an interesting dynamic. I also thought that conspiracy theorists, they derive comfort from the conspiracy, right? So they might be unhappy about their own circumstances in life, and if it's not your fault, and it's because of the lizard people or the Illuminati or the aliens or whoever is controlling the world and not allowing you to get ahead, well, you're comforted by that. And I think there's a little bit of that. The other bit on fake news and conspiracies and things like that, I just want them to be more fun, right? There was a time we had supermarket tabloids, where we have them still in North America, right? So, and you had the National Enquirer, that was like the top end, right? But then you had all these other ones that were brilliant, right? That had an alien growing out of Elvis's head. Elvis lives, but he's got this alien growing out of his head, and these kinds of things. And I just want us to go back to that. Make conspiracy theories great again. I really want those ones. They're so much fun.
I think we've got that.
Yeah.
There was in a slightly sinister way, but there's a UK newspaper that was suggesting the reason Boris Johnson, our Prime Minister, had coronavirus was because he'd been given it by the EU.
But that's
and they tracked that, right?
So
and literally, there's a double page. No, but there's a double page spread.
Okay.
It starts with that.
Yes, I saw that. Yeah.
And then it kind of goes on to peddle on the same double page. It peddles the Chinese virus thing.
Yeah.
Right? And it sort of says this came through because Chinese technology is suspicious, and so you had two bits of wonderful. Right. And I look at that and go, I think that's the start of what you're looking for, but in a slightly scary, will influence some people.
Yeah,
way.
That's the problem.
You want complete whack job
right?
stuff,
I want whack job stuff. Like this is going to influence certain people, and there'll be taxi drivers that believe this crap, and it's going to affect voting behavior. No, I want aliens. I want dinosaurs. I want Elvis. I want the fun conspiracies to come back.
Right.
And I'm hoping this will be a catalyst for that.
Well, look, I think as your influence grows, clearly, right. You have the opportunity to seed this stuff. Right. And so one of the things I think you're not doing enough of, Ben, I've noted, if this is your objective,
right.
I've been following your stuff on Twitter. It is frankly not outrageous enough. Okay. You are not propagating enough fake news.
Yeah.
And you're just simply being a little bit pedestrian. So I would encourage you to take a slightly more extreme view. Yeah. There were two gentlemen I saw, and I use the term loosely, video who were requesting donations for their particular church, who conducted a service that was repelling coronavirus, the devil that was coronavirus, and they literally announced that they had managed to repel it and that people should donate money. I mean, I feel you should be closer to them. We won't put a link to that in the show notes because I don't want people to look for it. You can find it on your own, right? Yeah. But I think I don't feel you're pushing the extremities enough. And I think there's an interesting point here, joking apart, right? Which is we can all contribute to this, which is we can all drag ourselves to the middle, but we can also propagate #fake news. And so I think, all things fake news could be your new podcast to help push that.
Well, I think that would be a fun podcast, actually. Let's pull out all the fake news that came out during the week and let's just see what are the most outrageous kind of awards, right? You could award people for the best fake news of the week. We could analyze trends, you could do like word searches, like, about what's going on with fake news in terms of, is there more Trump stuff? Is there more whatever it is? And I think that would be, I think it'd be a brilliant podcast.
So I think that's probably the perfect note on which to end. And if all things fake news becomes a podcast,
we're responsible.
We'll know that enough of you have listened this far to it. So, Ben, from my side, it's been an absolute pleasure, and hopefully the listeners agree.
Likewise, Christian, always a pleasure to connect with you and have these kinds of chats.
So there we have it. That was the first edition of the All Things Human Risk podcast. If you liked it, do let us know. If you didn't like it, you can also let us know and we'll decide if we do one of these again. I hope you found it interesting, stimulating. Remember, you can find Ben's podcast, the All Things Risk podcast, wherever you get your high quality audio content. Same is true for this, the Human Risk podcast. So if you're not subscribed to either, that is how you go about doing it. If you want to send feedback, you can find me on Twitter at Human Risk Blog, or you can email me, Christian at human-risk.com. And as we go through this coronavirus period, I'm going to be releasing more podcasts at a fairly short interval to give you something to listen to and while away the time that you're spending. In the meantime, remember to wash your hands and stay safe. Thanks for listening.